Okay, this is recording. Here we are, the third and final, for now, video in the series. Okay, I'm going to turn this around. Ding. Oh, there it is. And I've got my, whatever you call that thing, selfie ring. And should I be having it this way? I don't know. Okay, I'm going to try not to click any buttons, and I'm just going to, I'm going to need both my hands for this. So let's see if I can do this without. It seems like an odd way to do this. I can't really see the screen so good. There we go. Just try and make sure that I don't lose, have half the stuff off the screen when I do it. So there's that board that we were working with on the other one. This thing's getting loose. It's going to fall off or something. And I got the light down there. So this video shouldn't take as long as the others. I've got a few pieces of paper gathered together here. This is just from a magazine. This is from another magazine. And this has been printed on just standard printer paper in color from a child's religious studies book or something. So many of you, in many cases, may be printing something out just on standard weight printer paper, and it generally glues down pretty well. But now, again, we'll see what happens with this. I think it's the printer I use, and it shouldn't bleed or do anything too badly when I'm wet gluing it, but we'll find out. And that's, again, where we may need to test these kind of things and see what happens. Like different printers might behave differently with the color inks, just as different magazines, every different paper glues differently. You never know what's going to happen. And that's why sometimes if you're collecting from magazines, let's say, that's how I did it a lot in the past, but you may be doing it differently. You want to try and tear a little bit of extra and keep some samples together, because you find that, like, this one is from I think from an art forum or art news magazine, and I've used a lot of them. It's not as heavy. I don't think it's art form, but it is a little heavier and glossier, and it'll be a little slower to glue, and it'll want to, bubble up, and you'll have to keep coming back to it and watching it a bit, but it's got a certain toughness that you can kind of work with. Other things you have to be more careful. This is from an older magazine. I believe it's a 1960s Life magazine or something. The paper is slightly thinner, a little more transparent. You can see here in the backlighting, you can see right through it. Sometimes some papers will do that. Once you glue them down, you'll see a ghost image from what's on the backside. And that can be interesting, but sometimes it can be unwanted. And then you may want to know that when you're gluing, right? What's on the back, and is it going to affect what I'm seeing at the front? Again, a lot of times you can't know that until you've tried it. And that's why if I'm tearing from magazines and selecting, I have that, over there, we looked at, I've got that flat file, and it's full of file folders that's just full of stuff like this that I've collected. And, I've done it for years. So a lot of times I'll have a sense of, oh, that paper, I know how that operates. And as I say, the things that are going to happen is, basically, as you're doing it, you want to, if you can test it out, if you've got spare pieces from the same magazine, test it out and see what happens. See how it glues. Does it glue down flatly and quickly? How much stretch is there? Almost all papers are going to stretch a bit. And the way that manifests itself is it will you'll glue it down, and as you'll see what I'm doing in a minute, and it'll seem flat, but then it'll start to rumple and get bubbles in it, because it's sort of relaxing. The fibers are I guess you'd say relaxing. And a lot of times what you can then do, sometimes you can even pick up the edge and kind of carefully pull it and stretch it, or you can work it with the brush to stretch it. And some papers will stretch sometimes on a piece this big, it might stretch by an extra 1/4 of an inch. So, you know, as I say, I could go on about this kind of stuff forever, but you start to get to know it and you say, okay, that kind of paper, that's going to stretch a 1/4 inch more. So if I'm fitting it into a certain spot here, I've got to make an allowance for where it's going to stretch. And you might say, I'm going to make sure it stretches this way or it stretches this way, and then it's going to get up to where I need it. And you're kind of speculating to a degree. As I say, usually the stretch will happen in one direction. And quite often, like I can't remember, I'm not sure with this would have been in the magazine on a page like this. Quite often it's, you know, if the magazine is, you know, here, and this is how we would read it, it's going to stretch this way, and all the pages would stretch that way and not so much this way, right? So I might expect that this is going to want to rumple and stretch this way. So that's not a long dimension. So, you know, working it may, you know, it may go down fairly easily. But as I say, sometimes you get certain ones, you got to watch them. You think it's down, but you got to keep your eye on it while it's drying over there, because you may need to work it a bit more. Other ones, when you're working and stretching it, and I'm using this one because it may be like that, well, we'll see, is you can only brush them for so long and then they start to break down. I would suspect that this one I can probably work it an awful lot before I have any issues, but if I go too far, you might see it starts to break down the ink, and suddenly the red starts to, you know, show a bit of texture from underneath or something like that. Whereas other ones, as I say, some you can work and stretch and work with the brush and you're fine. You know, it's down, it's there, it's great. And then another one, you can brush it one too many times and then it goes and it tears apart, or you know, it starts to disintegrate. You never know, as I say, until you've tested the paper. But then once you have a sense of it, if you're gluing a lot of the same papers, you kind of know what to expect. And then, as I say, then you're kind of sailing. And so, you know, any different collage could involve all different kinds of paper. And, you know, you just have to try and test it when you can, test each of the different ones, and, you know, take into account. So basically, without going on too long here, I already have some glue pre-mixed. Now, some people like to use that stuff called Mod Podge, which is kind of like this. All I use is standard glue, right? Here's some Weld Bond or Lepages or whatever. This is basically white carpenter's glue. You know, as I say, it bonds most anything, dries crystal clear. So that's the thing, is it's a little bit milky looking, obviously. And you see that a slight bit with when you're gluing. But for the most part, basically all I've done is I've taken some of that glue, and much like with the paint, it's kind of thick, and initially I put a bunch in there and it's thick, and then I use that syringe like this, add a little water, I'll add a squirt, whoop, there we go. But this is pretty much the consistency I want anyhow, and then stir it up. But as I say, when you're starting, you're working with thick glue, add a little bit of water, stir it, stir it, stir it, add a little water, stir it. And what are you shooting for? Well, I always have a hard time trying to describe what is the consistency here. What is this? It's thinner than syrup, but you know, basically, sometimes I'll mix two different glues. I'll have one that's a little bit thicker and one that's a little bit thinner. You want it to be thin enough that it still saturates the paper, because what we're doing is we're not just putting some glue down and then sticking the paper to it. We're going to put some glue down, put the paper in it, and then brush glue over top of it and work it until it saturates the paper and creates a real nice bond with the board or the canvas. This works on canvas nicely, lots of things. As I say, it's not great for working on paper with paper because it's going to rumple the paper beneath it. So that's why it's good to be kind of working on a board. So if that gives you any idea, right, there's the consistency, right? It's fluid, but you know, it's not super watery, right? And again, that's just something that you have to kind of test out a bit. If you get too watery, it's going to lose its gluiness. But if it's a little too thick, it's not really going to soak into the paper. So as I say, some papers I've found, like a heavier paper, sometimes I'll use slightly thicker glue to put down on the board, and then put the paper in that, and then have a slightly thinner glue to work over top. And then sometimes I'm even using some of the blue towel to wipe up excess afterwards and smooth it out. And as I say, again, you just have to always be careful. Once you've got the gluing going, be careful of how you touch the paper and pull it, because again, sometimes you can be sort of holding one end and then you got your finger in there and you don't realize it and starts to stick, and you lift it off and it goes and it pulls up some of the stuff or whatever. So I'm going to start with this paper because it's the heavier stuff. And if I can recall, you know, if I always seem to grab papers and I'll say, maybe this one's going to give me some trouble. And then it always goes smoothly and I don't run into any of the difficulties that I might want to show. But if anything, you know, this heavier, glossier art magazine paper may well, you know, want to rumple a bit after I kind of, you know, feel that it's in place. And so because I'll be gluing the other things while it's drying, I'll be keeping my eye on it, right? And I'm just going to glue it down kind of right in the middle here. You know, I don't know what this board is going to become. So actually, I will pull this in a little closer. I find it weird working with, you know, with this light and thing in front of me. But basically, so I've got my glue over here, and I've grabbed a brush from over there with that, with the water. I cleaned the water. Now this is about a 1/2 inch wide brush. It's a little bit older, but you know, again, I'm using glue. So, you know, make sure you clean them always. Like, don't let it dry. You know, you want this to last. I've used this one for a long time. I got lots of brushes, but again, I'll choose different ones for different things. This one's a little bit raggedy, but it works just fine for gluing. So basically, you know, we'll talk about after glue in a moment, but basically I just want to give you this and say this is a basic technique that works great for gluing paper to all kinds of things and creates a really good workable bond, because you can work on top of this, draw on top of it, paint on top of it, and generally it stays in place. It doesn't lift up unless you really saturate it with water. So basically what I'm doing is I identify the area where I want this to be. And as I say, there's, you know, depending on how you're collaging, you have to plan things and kind of make maps and say, what order am I gluing this? Is this going on top of that? And there's lots of things to consider. But right now we're just dealing with the basic gluing. And, you know, if a bigger piece of paper, I might choose a bigger brush. This one will do for now. And I'm kind of going to just basically just flood this area with glue where I am putting it, so you can get a sense. You can see how fluid it is, right? So it's about like that. So it's not, certainly not thick as it comes out of the bottle, right? And watch out here, I'm making a mess, but I'll wipe that up over. I've always got some things there. There we go. So I'm being liberal with that glue and you know, filling the area. I'm going to get rid of the excess afterwards, you know, but I believe I've got an area about the same width that. So now I'm basically just putting it down in, and in this case, I'm starting at the bottom, laying it in, and I'm going to kind of work my way upwards. And if there's any upward stretch, it'll kind of go as I do it. And so what I'm doing, so you can see how in this one, you can see it kind of crawling and bleeding away. That's this paper where it's, you know, a little less absorbent. And so it's not, you know, really getting saturated, but it is starting to soak through from down there slowly. But as I say, this paper is going to be prone to, you'll see it starting to ripple. It looks like it goes this way, not this way. So I am going to be able to stretch that up that way. And as I say, because it's fairly tough, you can see when I'm lifting it here, you can see how it's rippling, right? So what I'm doing now is I'm just going to stretch it with the brush. And we'll see if I go too far and it starts to break down. But I think that this has probably got enough toughness that I can do a lot of this stretch out at this stage, right? And so I'm pushing it up and I can feel it going that way, right? You can see here right now we're almost, well, I guess you can't see it from there, but I've got a slight white gap before this yellow starts. But by the time I get up to the top, it's probably going to be touching that yellow there. So it'll have gone, you know, maybe a 1/4 inch, like I suggested it might. And so as I say, I'm just kind of working my way up that. I can feel it stretching. I'm even giving it a little tug to stretch it out, and then saturating it, working it a little bit more back to the bottom. So, you know, now it's had time that glue is soaking into it from both the back and the front. I'm stretching it out so any of those rumples are smoothed out and it's going to be nice and flat. And then now I'm just kind of getting rid of this excess. And you know, you can have an old one of these around here and just kind of do that. But with this kind of thing, I can even do this. I can even kind of come across this and wipe up some of that excess, right? Then take a look at what's going on. See, there's a slight lift over there, but I can, you know, brush that out, wipe that excess over there, and then just kind of go around the whole thing and make sure that it's all kind of glued down. And watch, there's a little air bubble there. I'm pushing it out to the side. So as you can see, this paper is very tough. It hasn't started to break down. There's a slight bit up here. Let me get up there, yeah. So up here in the gray, you'll notice it. And interestingly enough, well, I say you'll notice it, but it's kind of far away. I'm going to turn this sideways so you can kind of see this a little more closely. So you see here, where I was brushing at the end, this dark solid area here, it started to lose some of the gray, and it's done it the same way as this paint did. Is it's like it's picking up the texture from underneath, and so when I brushed heavily across this, it's taking the ink out of the paper, and I can even enhance that, right? So that's something you can do. I can say, okay, I'm going to just make that more consistent. So I'm going to soften that and regularize that texture in the paper here. Now, it's not doing it too much. Well, it started to do it on the paper here, or just a little bit on the red. So, you know, as I was finishing my brushing, I was kind of, you know, looking at the camera, looking at this, looking at that, and I didn't notice it just starting to break down, but that's fine. You know, it still looks good. And if it was really bothersome, I could come in with a faint bit of ink later and kind of ink across it to bring back that red. Or, as I said, you can kind of come in here and kind of enhance that by just brushing across it. And again, it's picking up that texture of the gesso underneath. So I'm kind of regularizing it so that it's consistent, brushing around. Oops, I guess you can't see me doing that. Brushing around over there. You can see the red coming off a little bit into the side. So, you know, I have overworked it slightly, but I've done it fairly deliberately. And now here I'm just coming with a light, just a brush with some water, just brushing up the excess and very carefully brushing across it. So that is super flat, and you know, it shouldn't start to lift or do anything anymore at this point, but I'm going to keep my eye on it while we move on to the next ones. And see what happens with that. But as I say, so now that's got to take some time to dry. But I've wiped the excess so there's not too thick of a layer on there. And then, as I said, is you can still work on it. But one of the things that sometimes you get is with the glue. Sometimes, say you want to pencil crayon this and you want to kind of create a little texture. Sometimes the pencil crayon will pick up on it all right, but sometimes it won't grab as much as you want. It's a little bit plasticky, a little bit thin, or sorry, not thin, but you know, or the pencil crayon is a little thin. Let's say it's you're trying to darken it, and it's not grabbing. It's too smooth. It's too plasticky. Now, in that case, we have something at the college, and you can buy it for yourself. It's called clear gesso, and you know, it's basically much like this gesso. It's very matte and kind of slightly gritty. And after this is all dried, I could paint over this whole board if I want, and it'll basically give it a whole consistent and receptive clear gesso coating. Sometimes it does dull the colors slightly because it's fairly thick, but not too bad. But what it does is it's basically like creating another gesso coat like this that's very receptive to using colored pencils and other things. And it also makes the whole surface consistent, right? Because if we looked at this later, after I've glued things, you'll see the glued areas look a little bit shiny, and then the painted areas are more matte, and there's variation. So sometimes as you finish things, you want to get consistency. Now, sometimes that'll be with a final spray coating. You'll just put a spray coat, and some people will choose matte or gloss or whatever for their various reasons. That's a finish coat. But if you want to keep working on things, there is something called workable fixative, but I don't like the stuff. It's not as workable as what I like. But again, depending on the materials you've used, you can usually get away with just using a brush to carefully coat the whole area with clear gesso. And then if you have found that you've been trying to do some work with pencil crayon or something like that on top of it, and it's not really receptive, that's going to make it much more receptive to that kind of work, the clear gesso. Now, sometimes you'll read somewhere, I remember somebody saying, oh, you can just use clear gesso for gluing, just like this. It's the same consistency, thin it down a little bit, glue your stuff with it. I thought, hey, what a great idea. Then it's ready to work on with whatever else. But what didn't I think about? Well, it's not smooth like this stuff. It's kind of gritty, like gesso, because it's got whatever in it that makes it's meant to be receptive and grab and sort of, hold on to materials. So what happens is it's kind of like using the sink scrubber or whatever, old Dutch, that kind of thing. It's too gritty. And so this effect that we saw here from just me brushing the glue, that would have been 10 times as much and much quicker. If I was using clear gesso to try and glue this down, the grit in the gesso would have started stripping and tearing apart that paper much more quickly. So I don't recommend using clear gesso for gluing because of that, but it's great to use after the glue's all dry and you want to, make the surface more receptive. Then there's a good approach to do that. But anyhow, enough talk. Let's do a little more glue in here. So I'm just going to get these done, and then that pretty much demonstrates it. As I said, this is probably going to look like it goes much like the last one did, but as I say, it is a different paper, and we'll probably find that it may behave slightly differently. And so once again, though, I'm doing the same thing. I'm just going to, actually, I'm going to overlap it a touch over this one, because as you'll see, with that transparency, we'll probably see that black band through there. So that's something you have to consider sometimes. What happens when you're gluing it over top of other paper? If I was gluing it entirely down on top of this, one, I would definitely want to wait until that glue was dry. But you do have to be careful, because that glue is going to soften a little bit when I put more glue on it, and I wouldn't be able to easily stretch this paper on top of that one, because it would want to grab onto it. So, that would be just something that I'd have to say, okay, I got to be careful when I glue that about how I go about that. You wouldn't be able to brush it as long. You wouldn't be able to stretch it as readily. So I'm going to place that just over that, just so we can see if we see it through. And then once again, take a little more glue and brush across it and work it, work. And so I'm sort of looking on the angle here to try and see what's happening. And, it looks like it's just sticking down nice and flat. But once again, there is going to be a little stretch. The smaller the paper, the less distance that things are going to stretch. So I'm kind of working both ways to see. And so sometimes just that little bit of work that you kind of do, I'm just blotting up a slight bit of that excess to see. So we can see there, you can sort of see through it a little bit right now. Like you can see the light and the dark in the background from the underside of the paper. I don't really see, it's covering up that black band of this quite well. I don't really see it. It's really more just showing through from the other side. And once again, I've brushed it a few times, and if I pull this up here, I'm going to change the light and pull this up a little closer. Well, it doesn't show, but basically I can see that it's just starting to do that same thing where you're the same kind of taking the surface of this texture and starting to strip away. But I stopped in time, so it's not, it hasn't shown up to the degree that I brought it out in this one. So there's no more lifting in that. The paper didn't really rumple. I didn't stretch it too much. It stretched just enough, and now it's staying flat. Once again, if I look at this on the side, here, you can see how, you know, there's no rumples, no creases. Same thing with the other one. It's nice, flat, tight to the surface, and ready to go. And so, again, this paper here is, I'm just going to tear that edge off. Oh no, it kind of mimics that band. I like that band, the double band. So I'm going to move this over. So this is a larger section of stuff. I've got a different brush here. Here we go. I'm going to grab this one. It's a sort of almond shaped. It's about 3/4 of an inch. Dampen it, take off the excess water, and basically the same thing. Now this stuff, again, this glues pretty nicely. There's not a lot of stretch in it. It has a fair amount of workability. And as I say, unless I used a different printer, it shouldn't bleed, or the image shouldn't be diminished too much. So once again, I'm kind of getting that area underneath saturated with a nice sort of wet layer of glue. Watch out for little bits that might get in there. Okay, and again, basically placing it, laying it down into place there, and working from one side across and saturating it, kind of working it a bit, watching what happens as I go. And you can see where it's sort of crawling a little bit on the heavier dark blacks, but usually if it's crawling a bit on the paper, just a little extra working. Now you can see there, so it's started to fold over. If, you know, if I brushed across it one too many times, it may just fold on itself and you get a texture. That's all right, but you can see how I can carefully, if I do it soon enough, lift it, give it a bit of a pull, and pull that out. And so I'm stretching it by hand as opposed to brushing it as much, so it's not as, you know, detrimental to potentially there. And then here you can see there's another one of those where I've laid it down. There's a bit of a rumple. Well, you can't see it too much there, but I'm still able to kind of lift it. Don't hold it too long. You can see how it's stuck to my finger and I've torn the corner. Oh well, I'll just pull it right off. And as I say, brush that out and get it nice and smooth. Now you may find, as I say, that, you know, as you're going, maybe you don't notice something and you fold it and you get a texture or whatever. Again, you know, if you're trying and you've been doing a good job at being consistently flat and flush, and you kind of get one that doesn't, you know, it doesn't go down right, you know, if you can afford to lose it, like I could basically pick this whole thing up off of here right now and go whoop, and get it out of there, wipe that excess away, and you know, and then put something else there. So, and in the case of this where it's been printed, well, I could just print another one and, you know, redo it. But if it's something you found and you've only got one, then you've got to, you know, how bad is it? Can I, you know, and of course this is now gone too long. I can't really pull that off out of there. Although if you really need to get rid of something later, sometimes if I were to basically sponge a bunch of water across this and let it sit, let it really soak in and soften the glue, and then kind of scrape, I could scrape it off of there and get it mostly off. It would make a fair bit of a mess, but I could get rid of it and, you know, create a new workable area. But what I was mentioning here, I'm going to just use this other one. That's that October 8th, 1974. At baptism, Jesus gives us the light of life. Well, that's a nice sentiment. So, and same thing, but this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to let, you know, I'm going to let some of that rumpling kind of happen and just fold it over and kind of roughen it up, if you will. Like, again, sometimes I'll glue things. I do a lot of gluing and printing on tissue paper, which is very delicate, and it'll usually get full of little creases and rumples that, you know, will actually hold paint and other things in a somewhat interesting fashion. So sometimes, you know, gluing things like that is desirable. And sometimes accident happens and then you say, well, I'm just going to kind of work with it, run with it. So like I say, I've done my initial brushing here and it's pretty flat and staying in position, but you can sort of see maybe if I get on the right angle here without knocking my glue over or something, what can we see? Well, there you go. You can kind of see where it's creating some slight rumples that I could easily sort of pull and stretch out. But instead, I'm going to kind of just zip in here, lift this up again, and, you know, just kind of fold it a little bit. I don't want it too much, right? But just do a little bit of this. And again, it's going to distort and hide some parts of the image, and this isn't necessarily the best thing to be doing it with, but I'm going to do it anyway on this one, right? And so, pull this, do a little fold in here, bring that back. Again, this is a lot like paper mache, right? Is the, you know, I'm saturating it. It's, you know, so, you know, it's creating a nice solid surface. So now I'm going to just kind of work those in, glue them down so they're relatively flat, but they still are folded over and they are like a texture there now. And a little more glue here, tiny bit. Work it a bit, work it, get those all flat. And so you can see it in there now. You can see those seams or whatever you want to call it, those folds, and they're quite saturated. They're going to stay put once it's dry. And, you know, again, they would catch ink or things like that, you know, if I was painting over top of it. And again, I can kind of lightly wipe some of the excess away. And there. So, you know, so basically, as you see there. So again, sometimes that happens because you're gluing away and then you don't notice a bit of a bubble and you go across it and it does that fold and then you're like, dang. Sometimes you can pull it up, stretch it out and rescue it, but sometimes, you know, it's too saturated or the paper, you know, you start to grab it and you realize, no, that's just going to fall apart if I try and do that. And you kind of have to roll with it. So, you know, basically, as I said, with the other stuff, with the paint and so forth, for any of these things, everything's a little different, right? And every time you do something, you're just observing what's happening, remembering, trying to, you know, kind of say, okay, this paper behaves like that, this one like this one I can do this, you know, this one's got a lot more possibility for me to lift it up and pull it and stretch it. This one I can't brush for too long or it's going to do that. You might say, ooh, I like that. I'm going to try and do that on this one. I could have, you know, when I was doing this one, when I noticed it starting to break down, I had my choice. I could say, okay, is that good? I can stop and keep it fairly intact, or can I brush it some more and let it, you know, start to pick up that texture? And sometimes you want to create a transition. I might say, I don't like that hard edge there, and I can just keep working it with the brush until the paper completely starts to break down and just, you know, sort of falls away, and then you create a different kind of edge, right? Or, and again, you saw with this one, I had a hard edge where I just had the edge of the paper and then I tore parts. And so, you know, how things overlap, how transparent different papers are, and as I say, how receptive they are to various kinds of work after they're dry, are all things to consider as you move along. So once again, once this is dry, and this one's not entirely dry yet, but getting there, you can see how it's got a bit of shine. You know, once it's dry, I could pencil crayon on a bit on it, but as I say, it probably would be a little bit where it would pick up a light bit, but it wouldn't, you know, if I wanted to really get some good solid pencil crayon or pencil, whatever, colored pencil work in there. Oop, I almost knocked over my glue over here, putting the lid on. If I you know, wanted to really work that area with particularly dry media, once this was all dry, then I would consider, you know, as I say, putting a coat of clear gesso on that to make it more receptive. But, you know, if you're just going to be maybe doing some washes like this over top of this, and that's where mixed media comes in, right? Is you can start to integrate one thing to the next thing is, you know, if this is a collage and painting that I'm doing now, suddenly I can say, well, I don't like this cream color in here. I want this to be more like the green coming up into here around the red. Well, then I can come in with some green and just do some washes and slowly sort of match it so that it gets where the green is very much like this here, and then maybe it just gets fainter and lighter as it fades up into here, until then it's just this yellowy, slightly green, yellow green up at the top, and then create a gradation that basically looks as though this green is bleeding all the way up into that one, right? And as I say, when you say, oh, I don't like that light texture on there that came up, well, come in with some ink and just lightly work across that. Or you say, I want to, you know, take down the intensity of that red. Well, you know, again, maybe that green wash just goes across everything instead, and then that takes down, knocks out that intensity of the red. So that kind of covers the 3 or 2, whatever you want to call it. I needed 3 videos to do 2 things, didn't I? But as I say, for those of you who have the patience to listen to me going on about things, it covers some of these things. And the reason I can go on about this, as I say, is because I've, you know, done this for a long time, and I've run into the various things, and I know the things I'm watching out for. And that's basically all I'm telling you in the end, is what you're doing is test things out. If you've got a test area that you can do it, observe what happens, keep that in mind, try to, you know, recognize where different papers or different kinds of media, how they interact with one another and what happens, and then say, well, now when I want to do this on my actual piece, what do I have to make sure I do to make sure that this works out? Is it, how much stretch does this have? How long do I have to kind of work it before it starts to break down? And remember that, and then, as I say, test things out, observe what happens, and sort of build your knowledge base of how materials are working together, or, you know, in opposition in some cases. And anyhow, there we go. That about covers some of the basics that should help you out with doing, as I say, the texture grid, and you know, even as far as doing some of the things you might do for the construction, the apprehending form, right? You might want to, you know, find a piece and like glue some paper onto it, or use that, bundle it up, create almost a paper mache around a part that, you know, helps hold the thing together, and also creates, as I say, a color, you know, an effect, whatever. Or you might want to use some washes on it and painting your clay piece, right? Rather than painting it one solid flat color, you might do some light washes and find that once, you know, once the clay is dry and you can paint on it, that it's going to be absorbent. Now the clay, we'll talk about that. The air dry clay that we use will still have some absorbency, so it'll be kind of like doing a fresco, is that the watery paint will want to soak into it a bit, and that's actually a kind of good thing. But it will again be operating in a certain way that you have to consider and control. So it's all about, you know, observe, you know, test, and then try to apply what you learn to doing the actual piece in the end. So in any opportunity to test things out, to do swatches, you know, test a paper, try not to skip that. All right, I'm going to end this, and that is my series of videos. Ding.